seberapa dagu.
You know that special feeling when you finally see the bigger picture? When you look at something from a different angle and suddenly it all makes sense. When people from different backgrounds and cultures work together, sharing insights, looking for answers, posing new questions about the world we live in. Remarkable things happen at intersections. And the European University Institute in Florence is where you experience it. Pursue your PhD in economics, history, law, or political and social sciences.
I decided to do my PhD at the EUI because it provides a unique structure of the PhD where you can fully work on your own project.
Our professors are eager to help you contribute in your own way to a better understanding of our ever-changing world. Our campus is located among the beautiful hills overlooking Florence. We offer a well-structured and fully funded PhD program with close supervision, advanced courses, and training opportunities.
The UI makes a huge effort in bringing top professionals to come and give seminars to us. They also pay a lot of attention in making sure that they're matching with your supervisor.
You will have access to our first-class research library and the historical archives of the European Union.
To me, the role of archive is fundamental. As an early modern historian, but at UI you find one of the most important archives in Europe.
You'll get plenty of opportunity to interact with visiting experts and leaders.
I would say that the student life at the UI is very lively. I mean, there are many clubs for sports activities or acting or music.
Experience a truly international environment in the company of over 1,000 scholars from 75 countries. You will make connections for life.
Why would I recommend the EY to new researchers? Well, I think it is because in this place you come here with your own research topic. You come here on your own proposal, and I think that's really unique. And I think if you use it right, then you can really make it an unforgettable time.
Apply now and become the best you can be.
We turn to network science for answers. Our studies suggest that we can open the economy as long as we protect workers who for their jobs must travel far. Network science tells us that a small fraction of long-distance connections is responsible for the rapid spread of a virus. This is illustrated in the top two charts. Block these long-range connections and the virus will suddenly spread much more slowly. This is illustrated in the bottom two charts. Also, new flare-ups of the virus will remain local longer, allowing geographically confined interventions at the city or neighborhood level. This is illustrated in the bottom left chart, where the virus gradually and slowly grows outward from an initial outbreak. By contrast, in the top right chart, the virus is quickly everywhere. So what should a government do if it has limited medical resources, limited ability and willingness to impose on individual freedoms? We believe that it may wish to focus those limited resources heavily on long-range commuting, transport and delivery sectors. To open up the local economy, give people local breathing room, but prevent the transmission of the virus over long distances. Fortunately, because most face-to-face contact is naturally very close to home, the burden on the economy and society may remain limited.
se trata d'un coup.
You know that special feeling when you finally see the bigger picture? When you look at something from a different angle and suddenly it all makes sense. When people from different backgrounds and cultures work together, sharing insights, looking for answers, posing new questions about the world we live in. Remarkable things happen at intersections. And the European University Institute in Florence is where you experience it. Pursue your PhD in economics, history, law, or political and social sciences.
I decided to do my PhD at the EUI because it provides a unique structure of the PhD, where you can fully work on your own project.
Our professors are eager to help you contribute in your own way. to a better understanding of our ever-changing world. Our campus is located among the beautiful hills overlooking Florence. We offer a well-structured and fully funded PhD program with close supervision, advanced courses, and training opportunities.
The UI makes a huge effort in bringing top professionals to come and give seminars to us. They also pay a lot of attention in making sure that they're matching with your supervisor.
You will have access to our first-class research library and the historical archives of the European Union.
To me, the role of archive is fundamental. As an early modern historian, but at the UI you find one of the most important archives in Europe.
You'll get plenty of opportunity to interact with visiting experts and leaders.
I would say that the student life at the UI is very lively. I mean, there are many clubs for sports activities or acting or music.
Experience a truly international environment in the company of over 1,000 scholars from 75 countries. You will make connections for life.
Why would I recommend the EY to new researchers? Well, I think it is because in this place you come here with your own research topic. You come here on your own proposal, and I think that's really unique. And I think if you use it right, then you can really make it an unforgettable time.
Apply now and become the best you can be.
We turn to network science for answers. Our study suggests that we can open the economy as long as we protect workers who for their jobs must travel far. Network science tells us that a small fraction of long-distance connections is responsible for the rapid spread of a virus. This is illustrated in the top two charts. Block these long-range connections and the virus will suddenly spread much more slowly. This is illustrated in the bottom two charts. Also, new flare-ups of the virus will remain local longer, allowing geographically confined interventions at the city or neighborhood level. This is illustrated in the bottom left chart, where the virus gradually and slowly grows outward from an initial outbreak. By contrast, in the top right chart, the virus is quickly everywhere. So what should a government do if it has limited medical resources, limited ability and willingness to impose on individual freedoms? We believe that it may wish to focus those limited resources heavily on long-range commuting, transport and delivery sectors. To open up the local economy.
Hello and welcome to the special edition of the State of the Union, organised by the European University Institute. Thank you for joining the third and final session of Europe, Managing the COVID-19 Crisis. This session will look at the COVID-19 pandemic and what it means for global cooperation. Participants in the virtual room can use the Q&A button to submit a query for the question and answer session. Use the hashtag #SOUCovid19 on social media. Thank you and enjoy the session.
Hello again. This afternoon, I'm with Kristalina Georgieva, the IMF chief. Thank you, Kristalina. Great to have you with us. Let me, before we get to developing economies and emerging markets, let me get your views on how you see the exit from the pandemic, the world after, or the new normal. Many people I talk to have given up on the V shape, although we did hear the Bank of England delivering a more optimistic yesterday. But most people are thinking more of a U shape, or as some people say, a bath shape. How long, how deep do you think the recession is going to be?
We have put out our projections a couple of weeks ago for a rather dire performance of the world economy, shrinking by 3% this year, and then partial recovery in 2021. Incoming economic data for many countries is below our already pessimistic assessment for 2020. And with no immediate medical solutions, more adverse scenarios might unfortunately materialize for some economies. So it is the unknown about the behavior of this virus that is clouding the horizon for projections. Assuming that we will see treatment and vaccines coming no later than early in 2021, then we can count on recovery. But let me make it very clear. We are thinking not of calendars for the next stages. We are thinking of a roadmap. In other words, data-dependent assessment as to how moving from stabilization to restart to recovery will go. We learned that the medical capacity has to be such that those that are sick can be treated, that testing has to be on large scale, tracing has to be on even larger scale, and that we have to adopt all micro measures that make it possible for a responsible restart. And it will be rolling over different countries, different parts of the world at a different time, making that recovery so much more complex.
And do you assume that what we are now referring to as the new normal is a kind of return to the world that we knew before the pandemic? What are, say, 3 elements that you think will change radically?
Yeah. Well, we need to remember that the crisis is also an opportunity. So we can build a better world. And we have seen it after dramatic crises in the history, not even in a long time ago, that this is possible. So what are the 3 things I believe we can pursue? One, make sure that as the economy shifts to sectors that are the winners of this crisis, and clearly the digital economy is coming as a very strong winner, that they contribute to society in a way that helps us not to leave people behind, not to see an increase in poverty. Second, take advantage. It is the moment we can build a more resilient world. And especially thinking about the other crisis, the climate crisis, use the massive fiscal stimulus we have to deploy to have a low carbon, climate resilient economy in the future. 3, what we have seen in epidemics in this century is that unfortunately, without conscious attention, inequality goes up. After SARS, after Zika, Gini coefficient grew by 1.5%. Unemployment of the low education level, in other words, the more vulnerable people, has gone up. So we have to zero on how we can have less scarring, not only of the economy, but of our societies from this crisis. And we can do it.
The IMF's been leading efforts to try and protect emerging markets from the fallout. And you've launched massive new emergency funding programs for a wide range of countries. You've arranged a debt relief package. You've given short-term liquidity lines for central banks with depleted reserves. Have these actions, in your opinion, stabilized emerging markets, or is there more that needs to be done?
At this point, what we have done is absolutely paramount to provide liquidity and financial lifelines to economies that are hit by this crisis and have less capacity than advanced economies could afford to deploy. And in that sense, the first line of defense, our emergency financing, has been and continues to be essential. And I'm very proud of the members of the fund because they quickly responded to my request to double access to emergency financing. And as of today, 50 countries, 50, have already benefited from it. What we need to do next is to zero on countries where conditions may become more complex because of very limited fiscal space, because of high debt levels. And then on a country-by-country basis, make sure that the protection that they might need is there for them.
It's curious that the pandemic hasn't hit some emerging markets as heavily as one would have thought.
What we see is indeed a lower level of mortality, lower level of morbidity, lower level of mortality in many developing countries. The scientists are wrestling to explain it. Is it demographics, much younger population? Is it because they have taken early measures? And we have to recognize that. They acted very quickly. Is it
there were lockdowns very, very early on?
Very early on. And is it because they're less integrated with Europe, the United States, China, where the massive increase has happened? But I want to stress that this should not fool us. These countries, especially the poor countries, are at very high risk from the economic impact of their own lockdowns, as well as the spillover. Remittances shrunk by 20 to 30%. Many of them are commodity dependent, export dependent. Prices have gone down dramatically. And what I want to focus on is that what we're doing to help these countries with debt relief and with financial support, paramount for them, for retaining their economies to be afloat, but also paramount for regional and global stability and for beating this pandemic.
One country whose problems precede COVID-19 but have been aggravated by COVID-19 is Argentina. As you know, private creditors are balking at the restructuring, the debt restructuring plan and the 3-year payment holiday that the government's proposing. How do you see that resolving itself? Do you think a default can be averted?
It is really between Argentina and the creditors to negotiate. There is still a time for these negotiations. They're ongoing, and I don't want to interfere. It is not for us. What I can say is that we have seen Argentina acting responsibly on 2 counts. One, with regard to measures to be taken in the context of this pandemic. They acted early, and they have protected the most vulnerable people. And 2, it is our impression that Argentina does want to bring the economy to a stronger stance in terms of its fundamentals. And they recognize it is important to find a pathway to resolve that crisis. Our judgment stands that is unsustainable. So let's hope that a continuous engagement would bring a good outcome. Argentina asked the fund to engage first for Article 4 consultations, and then they also signaled that they would like to have a program with the fund. And of course, we are there for every member, especially a member in tougher place.
There have been calls for the issuance of SDRs, including by our newspaper. Are you in favor, and do you think that the opposition that we have seen to SDRs, could that change at all?
Well, SDRs were helpful in the context of the global financial crisis. At that time, a new issuance provided much needed liquidity, and in this sense, there is value of considering. And in fact, I myself spoke about this being potentially one of the components of our response. Let me stress that at this point, the IMF is in a strong position. We have 4 times more lending capacity than prior the global financial crisis. And we have seen our membership mobilizing to give us more concessional financing. There is unanimous support for using existing SDRs to redirect them to developing countries. We are not yet at the point when there is the same support for new SDRs, but at our spring meetings, the view around the table was all options should be considered. We are in uncharted waters, unprecedented crisis. It requires unprecedented response.
So not impossible that those who've been opposed will come through. Yes.
We will continue to review our capacity. And one thing I can tell you, I was very impressed. Everybody of our members is in favor of us staying concentrated on how is this crisis evolving? Do we have the full capacity to protect emerging markets and developing economies from a dramatic shock? So they told us, watch it, come back to us, tell us if you need more resources. And we will.
I think we have. Sorry to interrupt. I think we've got only 1 minute left. So let me just get on to a very important topic. How worried are you about rising US-China tensions spilling over into the economic arena exactly at the wrong time for the global economy?
It is hugely important for us to resist what may be a natural tendency to retreat behind our borders. We are a better world when we work together. And this particular crisis, we cannot beat individually. We can only beat it working together. So I do urge us all to think of recovery that is going to be tough, and the contribution reigniting trade, economic collaboration would make to this recovery in everybody's interest to work together. Otherwise, costs go up, incomes go down, there is more poverty, less secure world.
Kristalina, thank you so much.
Thank you.
L'Europe ne se fera pas d'un coup.
know that special feeling when you finally see the bigger picture? When you look at something from a different angle and suddenly it all makes sense? When people from different backgrounds and cultures work together, sharing insights, looking for answers, posing new questions about the world we live in. Remarkable things happen at intersections. And the European University Institute in Florence is where you experience it. Pursue your PhD in economics, history, law, or political and social sciences.
I decided to do my PhD at the EUI because it provides a unique structure of the PhD where you can fully work on your own project.
Our professors are eager to help you contribute in your own way to a better understanding of our ever-changing world. Our campus is located among the beautiful hills overlooking Florence. We offer a well-structured and fully funded PhD program with close supervision, advanced courses, and training opportunities.
The UI makes a huge effort in bringing top professionals to come and give seminars to us. They also pay a lot of attention in making sure that they're matching with your supervisor.
You will have access to
So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, to this State of the Union panel on COVID-19 and global cooperation. Now, we are indeed living in times, in interesting times, and at times in which a paradox is really emerging in the international system. We have seen quite clearly how closure, how conflictuality is on the rise, but at the same time, we also know how global cooperation is needed more than ever. We're living in times of closure, of lockdowns, lockdowns that at national, at European, and at international level, we have never experimented. We are also living in times in which globalization, which of course had already been questioned for a number of years now, is being questioned perhaps more than ever now, with instincts towards reshoring, particularly when it comes to critical supplies. We're also living in times in which conflict is on the rise. We have heard now in the previous session, Kristalina Georgieva addressing the question of the growing rivalry between the United States and China, a rivalry which of course did not begin with COVID-19, but which with COVID-19 has acquired in many respects an ideological twist. It was a rivalry that played out in the trade and in the digital domains. Now we are seeing with this pandemic how it is acquiring an ideational, an ideological aspect as well. And at the same time, it's a conflict which is not simply a conflict between two major powers, perhaps two superpowers, but it's also a conflict which risks hampering the multilateral system, beginning, of course, with the United Nations, with agencies such as the WHO in line, but also other multilateral formats, such as, for instance, the G7. Now, at the same time, as I was saying earlier, it's also a situation which highlights very clearly, because of its transnational nature, how there cannot be national solutions to this conflict, be it in health or in economic terms. This is obviously true at European level, but it's true at global level too. Now, to address this paradox and a lot more, we have a wonderful panel this afternoon. Mari Pangestu, Managing Director for Development Policy and Partnerships at the World Bank. Alexander Stubb, Director of the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute and former Prime Minister of Finland. And let's see whether he joins us at some point during our conversation, Jeffrey Sachs, Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. Now, Mari, let me perhaps begin with you. And perhaps ask you how you expect this pandemic to affect the nature of multilateralism, beginning, of course, with the United Nations and with international financial institutions such as the World Bank, which, of course, you represent. and in particular, what you feel that can be done to strengthen global cooperation within multilateral mechanisms, both, of course, in the health dimension as well as in the economic recovery of this crisis. Unmute yourself, Mari.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation to join this panel at the EUI State of the Union. I kind of like the title State of the Union because in the US, of course, as you know, State of the Union has a special meaning. But it is a very good forum to be involved in, especially during these times when we have to have many conversations to get everybody on board, because this pandemic has shown us that it's touching everybody and all countries. This is perhaps compared to other crises, it's so overwhelming in the sense that it's affecting all countries and affecting all layers of the population and different levels of society and private sector and so on. So I think we all know that we can't go at it alone, that everybody makes those statements. But of course, the question is, how do we make sure that international cooperation is going to happen to address this very, very serious pandemic that we're having? Because we have, in the first instance, it is the health issue. But as we all are experiencing, we are, I believe you are in Rome, in Europe, in Italy, you are certainly feeling the impact on the economic and the social side. So it's very already and very quickly going to become an economic and social issue. And we all know the numbers are out there. Our own numbers will come out very soon in June. We are going into a very deep global recession, and we don't know whether it's going to be we know it's not going to be a V, whether it's going to be a flat, a Nike recovery, they call it the Nike shape, or an L. We want to avoid going to an L recovery. So these are kind of the enormous problems that we are facing. And yet we are in a situation, you correctly pointed out, even before going into this crisis, there was already a pushback against multilateralism. There was a pushback against globalization, kind of the post-global financial crisis aftermath and so on. And we were already veering towards nationalism and so on. So that's the challenge, but we are actually having a time where it's even more necessary for international coordination and action in response to the crisis. So I think, let me just say a few things. I do think we are seeing on two fronts, at least. We will have to see what will happen next, but at least on the health front and perhaps the food security front, this is the ones that I've been involved with recently. As, if you like, the short-term emergency response, we are seeing a lot of action and a lot of willingness and wish and push towards international cooperation. On the health front, the World Bank has come in, and I think it's almost going to be 100 countries that we're going to be providing emergency health response. And what we have done with our partners, and this is where the international cooperation is already happening, we have with inputs and coordination with the WHO and other UN partners on the ground. In places where there's conflict, we work together very much with the UN, as well as with NGOs that are on the ground. Right, so you need to have everybody come in, and what we did, hopefully, with the World Bank was to create kind of the platform. Here is the health emergency response that you need to do in a kind of a step by step way, including the procurement. And there was a huge international cooperation on this effort for the first phase of the emergency response. And now we're entering into the second phase of building up health systems and so on. And again, here, I would say international cooperation comes into place, including what was announced 2 weeks ago on this accelerator for COVID-19 tools, which is about cooperation to produce the vaccines, the therapeutics, and the diagnostics. Because we know that the end, or the certainty of the end of this pandemic can only happen with a vaccine. So there's a whole lot of effort. And here's the international cooperation angle, because it's bringing in all partners. WHO is in there, but is as one of the partners. And the World Bank is there because our objective is fair and equitable access for developing countries. And the private sector are there, the multinational, the pharmaceutical firms, including firms from developing countries, and all the international health partners, Gavi, CEPI, and Melinda, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Everybody's there. And the Europeans, I think, successfully raised seven something billion dollars to fund the $8 billion that the global pandemic monitoring has estimated as the need. So that's just an example of, okay, here's a crisis. There is an opportunity for everybody to get together. But I'm also not, what do you call it? I think it's great if you see what's happening, but of course, the devil is in the detail and in the implementation. And we've got to keep our eye on it to make sure that we continue to push this, because this is hugely, hugely important, besides all the other economic and social impact. And then maybe finally on the food security issue, I think this is, again, another very, very important issue. And here the international cooperation is about making sure that there is no restrictions on food exports. Actually, this is included also with medical goods. Restrictions on medical and food, vital goods are very, very important. Countries are naturally wanting to have their own buffer stocks in country, but it's hurting many other countries. In Africa, we have numbers to show that there's a huge dependence for the very fragile countries in Africa on just 3 suppliers, so 3 supplying countries in Europe. So the moment these countries restrict, then the vulnerable countries are just not going to be able to get access. So that's how serious the problem is. Same thing with food. It's only a few countries that are producing and exporting, and the moment they put in restrictions, you will have huge spikes in food prices. I went through the 2008 crisis as a trade minister, so I really am very close to this issue. And we really are beginning to see malnutrition also happening in many of these countries as people skip meals with incomes falling, and you don't want high food prices to add to this issue. So I do think international cooperation on food security is also going to be another area. We are seeing a little bit of movement on this with all the calls that have been made in the various fora, whether it's G20 and so on. And the World Bank certainly has been making that call. And some countries have relaxed their restrictions, but we have to, again, keep our eye on this. And we can talk a little later on more about, okay, in the medium term on many of the economic issues and continuing health issues, what should we be doing?
Thank you, Mari, and welcome, Jeff. I'm glad that you've managed to join us. Let me perhaps actually jump to you now straight away. Now, Mari was sort of talking a little bit about globalization, about the way in which this crisis is or may be affecting it. Now, it's clear that globalization had already been, if you like, questioned and has already been questioned for some time, be it the whole debate over the losers of globalization, be it the trends towards a decoupling of the US and Chinese economies. So coming from very different directions, obviously this has already been a debate for some time. Perhaps if you could share your thoughts as to how you feel COVID-19 is actually going to change, if at all, the nature of globalization moving forward.
Thank you very much. Clearly, we're in the biggest shock to the world since World War II, and big shocks change things. So we're going to have some fundamental changes in the world ahead. Which kind of change is still an open point, however, because big shocks can lead to constructive change or they can lead to destructive change. And we're still in the early days of this pandemic. Nothing has peaked. This is a long, long saga that we're going through. In principle, this is a pandemic that could be brought under control within months, but it is very unlikely to be brought under control in months because the steps that would be needed to bring it under control are decisive, high-quality public health interventions across the world in a systematic manner. This is what we should still be aiming for, but we are not achieving it. let me emphasize that the successful region of the world is the Asia-Pacific region, which has largely contained this pandemic. China, Taiwan, Korea, Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, and at least parts of ASEAN. I don't know whether Marie's country, Indonesia, is one of those or not. It's a drama. And it's one of the most important dramas for the world, whether Indonesia can contain this or whether it's going to get out of control. But Europe and the United States failed badly in even basic public health. And so both Western Europe and the US have a full-blown pandemic. The United States is an exemplar of a rich country that is a failed state right now to actually contain this. In fact, the US is in the process of giving up containment these days because of the incompetence and venality of our political leadership in the United States. So we are reopening an economy without public health measures, without public health control. We have more than 2,000 deaths per day, and that will continue for weeks or months ahead under the current direction under Trump. I see no chance of that changing in reality because of a broken political system that has been broken by corruption and mismanagement. So the drama for the developing world is still on. I'm so happy that Marie is at the World Bank and that what was said about trying to get a coherent response in the developing world is underway. But I fear that the efforts will be too little, too divided, not enough financing, and in the end that there will be major breaks and major pandemics in many parts of the developing world. Brazil is an obvious country which is going to go into chaos because it has an incontinent leader and they will not control the pandemic. And I fear that this will therefore spread in many places in the world and we will have years of difficulty. Having said that, that would mean that the economic downturn will be significant. The United States effectively has a 25% unemployment rate right now. The headline rate today is 14.7%, but if you look a little bit below the surface, it's basically about a quarter of the population that can't find work and is out of the workforce for involuntary reasons. We're at Great Depression levels, and there's more to come. There will be waves of bankruptcies ahead. One of the great divides in the world is if you have a central bank or not that has a currency that is stable. So the power in the world lies with the US, China, the European Central Bank, if it's not destroyed by its internal divisions, Japan, I would say Bank of England, Bank of Canada, and a few others. For most of the developing countries, foreign exchange reserves are scarce. Food imports are often very large. The downturn of economic activity and exports is significant. And so I would expect on top of pandemic spread, economic crisis in a lot of the developing countries. One thing that would make this even worse is if we start to have financial crises in these countries in the form of defaults on both the sovereign debts and commercial debts, but I think that this is likely rather than unlikely, in which case we will have compounded a pandemic crisis, an economic crisis, and a financial crisis soon. And if that occurs, it's not a prediction because there is a way out, which we're not taking, but if it does occur, we will have depression scale global crisis for several years to come. Now, the way out would be rational, scaled, and solidaristic policies on many fronts, starting with public health and including financial solidarity to get through this crisis. I don't see it underway. I blame first and foremost my own country for this. The United States politics are antithetical to multilateralism right now. And the idea of US politics is to blame China and create deeper divisions. That's what makes Great Depressions, actually. This is the history of the world, that if the great powers are divided, global problems that turn into even deeper crises. If the global powers cooperate, then we can use our rationality to solve these challenges. So I'll just say, I don't think I have more time, but my feeling is that this is a crisis that has a solution. We have about 1.8 billion people, by my count, in countries that have this under control. So it's not just a hypothetical, it's a practical reality. But we have another 1 billion where it's out of control. And we have about 5 billion where the battle is underway right now. But the 5 billion are mainly the developing countries that need foreign exchange, need a cooperation of Europe, the US, and China, or Europe, the US, and East Asia, but aren't finding that kind of cooperation. And I think the fate of our world hangs in the balance. But I'm not very optimistic, I have to say, given the hostility of the United States political leadership to rationality and to decency. And given that, I'm very, very worried about us turning into a much, much deeper crisis than would have to be the case.
Thanks, Jeff. Now, Alex, moving to you. Jeff painted a pretty bleak picture there. And indeed, if one is to look at the United States and to China, it is difficult to disagree with it. Now, he did obviously also refer to Europe. And the question is not that Europe has been doing fantastically well, but particularly when it comes to global cooperation, we are slightly more confident here that this is at least something that we want to try and do. So in this sort of situation in which we do have 2 and potentially 3 power blocks, if you could sort of share your thoughts as to how you think, respectively, the United States, China, and Europe have been facing this crisis and what this means in terms of global cooperation.
Thanks a lot, Natalie. And it's a great privilege to be on the same panel also with Marie and with Jeffrey. I was just wondering how to place myself. And I think we are in a situation where we have a perfect balance between the speakers, because Jeffrey, he was the pessimist. I will be the optimist, and Marie was probably the realist in this book. So I'll give my sort of stinted, optimistic view. I'll start just by saying that, you know what we have a tendency to do, and it's the following. Number one, we over-rationalize the past. We try to look at examples from the past and say, this is how it happened. Number two, we over-dramatize what's going on at the moment. And number three, we underestimate what's actually going to happen in the future. And I think this is very much the issue. So, you know, if I look at the fantastic stuff that Jeffrey did in the post-Cold War in sort of liberating East and Central Europe and creating market economies, that was very much sort of rational thinking at the time. Now, the big question is this 1945? Is this 1989? Or is it 2008? My answer to that is no, it is not. It is a very significant event in world history and certainly in our lifetime, but I would not rank it in the likes of the basket of the end of World War II, the end of the Cold War, or even the financial crisis in 2008. However, I will argue that this crisis will have three very significant ramifications. The first one is linked to the state, the second one is linked to global affairs, and the third one is linked to power. Now, on number one, the state. There's always an inherent tension between market and state. I think this crisis will actually tilt us more towards state. Sometimes state control, sometimes state-driven economy, sometimes even state surveillance. And this is very different from 1989, where we actually tilted towards the market. But this sort of state trend, I would argue, started with 9/11 to a certain extent. And then it continued with the financial crisis when the sovereigns, us, had to bail out a lot of the banks. And I think COVID will give a bit of a nail to the coffin, or at least push state power into the sort of right side of the pendulum. I also think, having said that we're going towards the state, one of the key issues is going to be different types of transnational networks. And I don't say this, or perhaps I do, because I'm now the director at the School for Transnational Governance, but we have to start to understand that the world is much more complicated than just state-driven or market-driven. It has players trying to influence and impact decision-making from all different quarters. It is the private sector, it is academia, it is journalism, it is civil service, it is international institutions. So we have to try to understand this package. But I would, however, argue we're moving towards the state in this one. My second ramification is on global cooperation. And here, I think I'm a tad more optimistic than most. I would actually argue that what happens here is one step backwards in globalization, but then two steps forward. And let me explain. It is very natural for a nation state to go native in these types of a crisis. First, what you do is protect your own. Then when you realize that the virus is global and doesn't recognize basically state borders, you're going to have to start looking at things differently. And this is where international institutions and multilateralism comes in. And I fully agree with Jeffrey on the current American administration. And it's basically voluntary marginalization from world politics. That's what Donald Trump is doing. But I think at the end of the day, this is going to strengthen the UN. It's going to strengthen the World Bank. It's going to strengthen Kristalina Georgieva and the IMF, as we heard before. And actually, my argument at the end of the day, it will also strengthen the European Union. Yes, there will be some discussion on protective measures, on strategic autonomy and other things. But at the end of the day, I think this will strengthen multilateralism because there's no other choice. If we want to get rid of these types of pandemics, or at least prevent them, we need more information sharing. And I think everyone understands that. My third and final ramification has to do, Natalie, with your question and the sort of power struggle that's going on. My argument is, and I don't say this only because I'm writing a book on it, but there will emerge three power blocks out of this, which have already been in the making. One is China, which is obviously a centralized, authoritarian capitalist state. The other one is the United States, which is decentralized capitalist and at the moment, of course, very bipolar and divided in its politics. And thirdly, there's the European Union, which is decentralized. I'm not saying social democratic, but believes in social market economy. And at the end of the day, is actually quite messy. It is multilateral or transnational, if you will, by definition. And these three will be looking for various forms of influence in the package. So we are in a world, I think, in a post-COVID world where there's no clear world leader anymore. And all of these three players are trying to find their space. Of course, there are different ways of measuring this. I think that at the end of the day, when we come out of this, the analysis will be about the following elements. Number one, how many died? And here is where, it's a crude calculation, and certainly, Jeffrey's point about Asia Pacific is a correct one at the moment. Number two, how quickly do different regions of the world bounce back economically? And I think the jury is very much out on that. And number three, how well do you actually communicate this? And here, interestingly, China did a pretty good job in communication. And in the beginning, Europe did a really crappy job in communication. The problem with Europe is that it's inherently bad in communicating, because I say this as a former prime minister, what you do is everything that's good comes from you, everything is bad, you blame Brussels. And that's exactly what happened in the COVID crisis as well. Whereas we forgot that if you look at the package that the European Union has provided through the ECB, through the EIB, through the European Commission, through the ESM, and probably through a COVID fund, it's colossal. It's a bigger stimulation package that anyone has been able to provide. But will European leaders say that this is great? No, they will say, look, we're not using taxpayers' money on this one. So my conclusion is then the following. I think COVID is significant, but not dramatic. And yes, it is going to change a lot of things, but it is not going to change the world completely as we know it. Number two, there will be a pendulum which shifts more towards the state, more towards global cooperation, and probably more towards Asia and China. And it'll be interesting to see where Europe places itself in this game. And number three, and finally, I say this, I do think the world is becoming increasingly transnational. That's why I think it's very important that you look at what the School of Transnational Governments at the EUI does. Those are my 3 points. Thanks, Natalie.
Little spot there. Now, you have all you've painted a sort of pessimistic, optimistic, and realistic picture of the present and the future. Now, let me ask you now to sort of switch into the sort of what to do mode, the three of you, and also ask you to be somewhat briefer in your questions, so I can also get to some of the questions which are coming in. And Mari, let me begin with you again, asking you perhaps if you could sort of hone in on the trade health nexus and tell us how is it that we can, at this point in time, ensure that critical supplies continue to flow across borders?
Okay, I'm going to take Alexander's example here and say our mission, the World Bank, is about making sure that we do not lose all the success we've had in reducing poverty, and not lead to inequality as well. So the shared prosperity mission. So this is the lens that we use to look at how we need to, what you asked us to talk about the next steps in policies, priorities of international cooperation. So I'm going to give you a list of the priorities of international cooperation. I think on health policy, I already mentioned what I thought would be important, and I think here actually the EU has taken a great leadership on the cooperation to really accelerate the research and development and the production of vaccines and therapeutics and diagnostics. And here you actually have an example of state and non-state and international organizations coming together over this very key issue. And so keeping open trade is in medical equipment and supplies, sharing vaccines and technology, and I would say regional cooperation. I think Jeff mentioned Asia Pacific. I think East Asia, Asia Pacific, they're actually going to be the first ones probably to start opening up. They're already opening up. So there's a lot that we can sort of share and learn in terms of going from lockdown to opening up. What can we learn about that? And I would say establishing a task force to collaborate on protocols for health certification of international travel, both before and after universal vaccination becomes possible. So it's like your yellow card. And with technology today, you can have that all on your biometric card or whatever is in your cell phone. I think this is going to help tracking and tracing in the future. In terms of international economic policy cooperation, I think what we are trying to do in the bank are maybe on several fronts. Some of it Jeff mentioned. We want to make the financial, the fiscal sustainability issue, the debt issue. As you know, the World Bank and IMF have called for debt relief for the IDA countries. I know that many are saying this is not enough, more needs to be done. What's the role for MDBs, and most importantly, private commercial creditors? And what about the non-IDA countries? These are the issues that we need to have continued international cooperation, and it's not just state to state anymore. It is about how to take a collective action. Because if you don't take collective action, then as Jeff pointed out, something that was started out as health becoming economic will become a financial crisis. And then, we have developing countries are not like Europe or the US, where how much is it? 2% of GDP or 3% of GDP is in your stimulus or whatever. It is very, very big number. And if you translated that into developing countries' resources, it's just not there. So if you have limited resources, but you have to undertake policies in response, whether it's in the short term for social protection or for making sure you can get out of the crisis, well, how are you going to spend that money? That's really the big question that we at the World Bank are struggling with. So we have these pillars of policy responses, drawing on all the policy experience and expertise we have in the bank to try to help countries come up with the right policies. Because if they come up with the right policies, it's going to help the world in terms of the recovery. And this includes the middle-income countries. And I do think if the middle-income countries, especially in East Asia or Asia-Pacific, recover first, that's going to be good for the rest of the world, because you start creating a demand for the world. And we have three pillars, basically: protect lives, which is the health response; protect livelihoods and human capital. I want to emphasize that it's not just about putting money in people's pockets who've lost their jobs, but how do you protect the kids who don't go back to school? How do you protect the women? We have seen increased gender-based violence. And so there's a lot of issues when you go into each of these pillars that I think what we would like to help with is coming up with kind of the global public good, which is, this is the kind of appropriate set of responses that you need to do in the short term, given your limited resources. And if you get it wrong, you're going to actually affect your recovery. This is the other component. You have to link between the short term and the longer term. And I think that on the longer term, what is it? The famous saying, I hate the saying, but I'll say it anyway: never waste a good crisis. So how do you use this crisis as opportunity to come out of this better? I say it's about protecting the future, and that includes climate change. People make this parallel that more people die from the climate change, damages from climate change than they did from the pandemic. Of course, we don't want anybody to die. So, but we need to keep our eye on this building back better idea, and it could be in many fronts. And this is the big conversation that we have to have. What is the world going to look like after COVID? Including, greener recovery. We talk about, I say green and blue recovery, because let's not forget the oceans in there. And sustainable development. Jeff is I don't know what I would call you, Jeff, the godfather of of sustainable development. And we should not forget that. And the World Bank, and we'd welcome any input from anybody, that we are coming up with, I don't want to call it a checklist, but a list of things that we have to focus on as we are designing programs to get out of this. If you're going to have a stimulus on infrastructure, build sustainable infrastructure, go for renewable energy, et cetera, et cetera. So this is, I think, an opportunity. Maybe I'm not sure I'm an optimist or a realist, but I do think one of the big issues is, a number of you have mentioned it, the problem is big. We have limited resources. So we need to pool our resources, and resources is not just financial resources. We need to pull our resources together and our purpose. We have to have around a sense of common purpose that we agree on, and this is not just financial, but the role of civil society to remind governments that we don't want the fiscal space to be used for saving state-owned enterprises that would have gone belly up anyway, things like that. So I think this is hugely important, and we need to have many more discussions on this.
Thank you, Maddie. Jeff, in fact, I wanted to ask you the green question. One thing is to have a recovery, quite another, and it's not at all to be taken for granted that the recovery is going to be sustainable and green. In fact, probably the default option is that it won't. So what is it that can be done and should be done now in order to ensure that it is?
Thanks a lot. I wanted to say one thing about the optimism, pessimism, realism discussion, which is that all of those scenarios are possible. And in fact, the future is open in that way. This is really important to understand. Prediction is one thing, but constructing the better outcome is, of course, what we're really talking about here. With Alexander's very wise and pertinent remarks, I would add just a couple of things. He mentioned three key dates, 1945, 1989, and 2008. I always have two more dates in mind, 1914 and 1919. 1914 was the start of evil that lasted 30 years in the world and that had no deep reason for having occurred in the first place. And 1919 was the very bad judgment of how to respond to the first war that set some of the path to the second war. So I think that these are key dates. The thing that the only statement I disagreed with of his statements was when he said it will strengthen multilateralism because we have no other choice. This is absolutely not true in history. We have no other rational choice, but that doesn't mean we will take it. This is the only rational choice. The whole most famed part of the entry to World War I was Norman Angell telling us in 1910 in the Great Illusion that war was so destructive that it was completely irrational. We have no choice but peace. And of course, we went the other way. Norman Angell was completely right. We had no other rational approach, but we chose the irrational one. And he wrote again in the 1930s, well, I told you before World War I there was no other rational way, and now I'm telling you again, we can't have war. And yet he wrote again in one of the more ill-timed books for a second time, just before World War II. So one can't say we have no other choice. We are capable of disaster in humanity. And this is, for me, always not to be a pessimist, but to point out how often we do things very, very badly. And of course, I'm especially worried because of my own country right now, which has 6,000 nuclear warheads and Donald Trump is president. And it scares me every day. So this is why I speak in those terms. Now, in terms of what to do, I would quickly say 6 pillars to think about, everyone having a domestic and an international dimension.
Jeff, very, very quick, though.
I will be very quick on them. The first pillar is public health. If we don't get the epidemic under control, we will not get anything else under control. So we must learn the Asia-Pacific experience and apply it globally. This is number one. Number two is we need social protection during this sharp period. People have to eat. That's both a physical and a financial aspect that has the national and the international dimensions to it. The third is finance. We could have a massive financial crisis on our hands in short order if we don't attend to the solutions. The only ones that won't are the ones with the major central banks. We have to have the IMF and World Bank together operating like a central bank for most of the developing countries. But that's not how the system is constructed right now. That's what Keynes wanted it to be in 1944. But instead, we have a very tight spigot. There is no limit really to our resources right now because they're so underdeployed. But you need dollars or euros or renminbi in your hand, Marie, so that you can make sure that that supply chain operates. That's what's really needed right now. You need central banks backing you for open liquidity, and that we don't end up with a complete disaster of a crash right now, which is quite possible. The fourth is information technologies. One of the heroes of control is mobile broadband and e-governance and all of the apps that come along with that. One of the lessons we should learn, we knew it beforehand, but we need universal access to digital technologies as a basic for governance now. You can't govern unless people are connected, and people cannot play their full role, whether their children are in distance learning or you're trying to get telemedicine or you're trying to download a government license from a website, unless everybody has access. So ICTs are crucial. Fifth point is there will be deep structural change. We have 25% unemployment in the United States right now, in effect, headline 15%, and then another 10% who aren't at work that would like to be at work. Many of those jobs are never coming back. Amazon is going to gobble up half of the retail sector. Those shops are not going to reopen, I'm telling you, because they were already on their way out slowly. Now they're on their way out overnight. And so we're going to have massive structural change underway, and we should understand that much better than we do, because we're going to need a new kind of growth and development. It will be more digital. It will involve more job sharing. It will involve more leisure time. It will involve more work from home. It will involve more ongoing education. Many positive things, by the way. I love digital technologies. I love the fact that we can discuss this and have such an easy time to meet. Everyone apologizes. I'd like to be in person. Frankly, I'm glad I'm sitting at home and having a chance to chat with you. I don't want to be in an airport today. So I'm happy about it. But it does mean we're going to grow in a different way. And Marie is completely right. We need the green and blue growth in the future. The oil industry should not come back, period. Stop. Go out of business. Done. But now we need renewable energy growth for the world. We need the digital growth for the world. We need education-based growth for the world. It's wonderful. We can make a much better world. And so I'm not a pessimist at all in terms of our capacities. And what we should be doing is construction of that better world.
Thank you, Jeff. Now, let me turn immediately actually to the questions, because we only have 6 minutes left of our conversation. And Alex, let me turn to you with a Europe question here. Now, with a withdrawing United States and an assertive China on the world stage, is there a better moment to think about Europe and its leadership role in multilateral and global cooperation? So what is it that we should do as Europeans to promote multilateralism, which we define as our existential interest?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Before I answer, I just wanted to show to Jeffrey that I fully agree with you on the possible rationality versus irrationality argument on multilateralism, because right here in front of me, I have Stefan Zweig's The World of Yesterday, which of course begins with 1914 and the cultural international revolution that existed, and everything started going sour after that. I think this is a €1 million opportunity for Europe, in a sense that Europe is by definition a laboratory of multilateralism. In order for you to be able to cope in these types of a situation, you have to know how to muster compromise. You have to know how to share sovereignty. And there's no better place doing that than the European Union. Whether the European Union then can take leadership in this is a completely different issue. Of course, the current commission is working very hard on this. It wants to be a geopolitical commission. It just had a broad tender for health funding and helping out and doing the coordination. If I may simplify things, I would probably say that if these three main players are on the stage, Europe should play 75% with the United States because of the value base. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. America will be back, but also 25% with China. And what I'm trying to say here is that Europe could quite easily mediate a little bit and work as an intermission between China and the United States to make sure that things don't turn out too nasty. And I think this would be a very smart power play on the side of the Europeans. Whether then, how would I say this diplomatically, national leader egos will allow Europe to take that role is a wholly different answer.
Absolutely. Jeff, let me turn a question from Heather Grabby from the Open Society to you. How could the crisis recovery funds be used to accelerate the global transition to zero carbon emissions? And what conditionality should go on public bailout funds so that companies use it to shift towards zero carbon?
I think that each region of the world needs what Europe has put together. The European Green Deal is really important. It's the most coherent, single, regional statement of what a path to a zero carbon economy looks like. And if we could get in the United States a U.S. Green New Deal with a new administration starting in 2021, if ASEAN would have an ASEAN Green Deal, if China's Belt and Road Initiative would be a green Belt and Road Initiative for the first time, because it's not right now, but should be, then we have the pieces of a framework all over the world for this path that we need for investment-led recovery, which is going to be vital anyway, and for meeting the needs of the Paris Climate Agreement, which is to decarbonize by 2050. And I think that this is has been obscured, of course, not only by this crisis, but by the U.S. politics, which has been an all fossil fuel politics under the Trump administration. And, you know, if Trump continues as president, many, many things are going to go wrong in the world in the years ahead. But if we are fortunate enough to get rid of that disaster for the U.S., then we'll have a chance, actually, for this green approach. In terms of business, we need regulation. We don't need to bribe business not to pollute. We need to tell them not to pollute. We need to phase out the fossil fuels. The United States is run by business running government. This is where the U.S. fell to pieces. We corrupted the political system so that we don't regulate anymore. We literally have government by lobbyists, and that is why the U.S. fails. But in other places, we need government by regulators for the common good. And then we tell the businesses, you're not allowed to produce internal combustion engine polluting vehicles after 2030. That's clear enough. No fracking. We don't need your stuff anymore. We're in the biggest glut imaginable in fossil fuels and so on. And with proper regulation, we could put the European Green Deal, the ASEAN Green Deal, the Green Belt and Road, the US Green New Deal, we could put that into operation.
Thanks, Jeff. And Marie, let me ask you a last question. Do you think that shrinking Western demand due to rationalization of value chains could be replaced by growing internal demand within the developing world?
I don't think it's an either or. I think we need to do both. We need to strengthen the capacity and capability domestically to increase productivity as well as be more competitive and so on and so forth. And we do have to be cautious about what Alexander was saying about the return of the state, because during the crisis, what could happen is that you could have a lot of nationalization of private assets, and then, but when you get back to normal, you have to then return it back to private sector. And we have to make sure that that's done in an orderly way. And I think in today's world, whether you're talking about products, services, or even people, right? I think the other thing that we worry about in this global value chain is also the movement of people. Whether it's labor mobility, for some countries, like remittances is huge, a huge source of income in the developing world. So we are very worried about the pushback for, you were saying it earlier, reshoring, the desire to do things in country, the reshoring is going to be inconsistent with the development of the supply chains and the global value chains. And then there's an anti-migration, anti-use of foreign labor, anti-this, anti-that. And this is going to, I think, be a pushback against the development gains that we've had. We have very strong empirical evidence where trade has led to higher growth and reduction of poverty. Whilst we have to have complementary policies to make sure that it's shared, the inequality part of it. So I think what I do hope will happen starting now and into the recovery is to maintain this openness and to actually emphasize the point. We have huge studies on these global value chains, that if you're worried about this, the crisis, the COVID crisis has made countries worry that of the concentration of reliance on certain suppliers. So the instinct is, we have to do it ourselves. Actually, the answer is not that. The answer is diversification. Yes, you should not be relying on one supplier. You should be, diversified in terms of the suppliers you have. And then the world, there will be this dynamic global value chains that will emerge. But what I do think will happen, and this will be good for developing countries to consider, is that maybe there will be more regional value chains rather than global. And probably Asia Pacific will be the region that is a good example where this will happen. And I think Africa is also having an initiative for regional integration. And I'm a great believer in the regional integration story coming from East Asia. So we can, if you can't achieve the global trade openness, rules-based system, you can start at the regions. And East Asia has this regional comprehensive economic partnership that involves the 15 large economies, which includes China, Japan, and Korea, and the ASEAN countries. If they can start just doing what they need to do, continue opening up, that will be a good signal for the world. And it will also be helpful for the world recovery. And I'm hoping that, I see initiatives in Africa as well, even in the Middle East, with the sharing of energy, for instance. So I think this is, we need to keep our eyes on that, because otherwise I do think there will be a negative benefit on development, on the development dividend.
Thank you, Marie. And of course, this more regionalized world also adds an additional rationale for European integration, but also for Europe's relations with Africa, as well as Europe's transatlantic relations. Anyway, so we started off with a pessimist, an optimist, and a realist, but I think you've all been absolutely wonderful also in putting forward ideas as to actually how to move towards Alex's optimistic scenario. So thanks very much for this wonderful hour together. And I understand that now we move on to the Italian Prime Minister for a closing. Thank you.
Bye. Bye, Natalie, Jeff, and Alex.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad that the State of the Union takes place in spite of the COVID-19 crisis, even if through video messages. This event provides, in fact, a concrete opportunity for a high-level debate on the state of the European Union, as well as on the future of our continent. A future-proof approach on the European project is more needed than ever in light of the COVID crisis that represents a severe and unprecedented challenge for the European Union. Our continent will prevail only if it will be capable of staying united and of implementing a coordinated response based on the fundamental principle of solidarity. If we want to overcome the medical and economic crisis, a coordinated and solidarity-based response must be a global one, as I have been underlining in all institutional fora, not only at the European councils, but also in the video conferences of the G7 and of the G20, as well as last Monday in the pledge conference of the EU coronavirus global response. Furthermore, we are facing an economic symmetric shock, differently than in the financial crisis in 2008 and 2010 and 11. So the response must be different from the one adopted in the above crisis. We need an appropriate and courageous response instead of measures and actions that may cause further divergences in the European economies, as it happened in 2008 and in 2010 and 11. If we don't rapidly adopt and implement a coordinated European response based on solidarity, courage, extraordinary measures up to the unprecedented challenge, the European project will be at stake. The challenges in this current crisis are a timely and full recovery of the interconnected European economies, the single market that is a fundamental pillar of the European Union, and the value chains which lie at the heart of the European industry, will all depend and must rely on each other. The European Union should give to the European citizens a clear message, proving that it has a common vision of what is needed to overcome the present crisis and to promote a faster recovery in the whole continent. The European Commission, with the suspension of the Stability and Growth Pact, with the state aid temporary framework, and with the flexibilization of structural funds, and the European Central Bank, with the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Programme, have been making a significant effort to support European economies. It is now up to Member States to do their part. In this regard, the European Council, in video conference last 23rd of April, is a good basis for progress. The European leaders decided, in fact, not only to make the three proposals agreed in the last Eurogroup, the SURE programme, the European Investment Bank's Fund and the ESM, operational by 1st of June 2020. The European leaders also agreed in work towards establishing a recovery fund, and on the fact that the fund is needed and urgent, and there shall be a sufficient magnitude targeted towards the sectors and the geographical parts of Europe most affected, and be dedicated to dealing with this unprecedented crisis. This means that the Recovery Fund is not anymore a promise and can become a concrete proposal. The outcome of the last European Council shows that the European Union can be up shows that the European Union can be up to its values and duties if it is able to link the concept of solidarity to the less romantic concept of a community of interests. When this happens, the European avoids failing on ambitious decisions. The crucial challenge is now translated to political signal on the Recovery Fund into reality, before it is too late both for the European economies and the society. The economic impact of the COVID-19 crisis is a huge and tragic one, as the European and international economic forecasts confirmed. So, Europe must act without further delay to start the economic recovery. To this goal, the three measures, SURE, EIB, ESM, are insufficient as they amount to a fraction of what other major economies, I think, for example, USA, are spending to sustain their firms and families. The Recovery Fund actually borrowing on the markets, as distinct from the total resource it mobilizes, must be of a considerable size, at least 1 trillion euros, to bring the total envelope of a European economic response, taking into account the SURE, EIB and ESM, in line with the overall financial needs of the EU that most researchers and institutions, including the ECB, estimate of more than 1.5 trillion euro, net of state guarantees. There are other priority aspects of the Recovery Fund that we expect to be included in its preparation. First, as for its mission, the fund is essential to guarantee the level playing field among member states as we face the downturn and prepare for the recovery. Second, the fund should be based on a balanced mix of loans and grants, being the latter essential in order to avoid further asymmetries in respective debt stocks. This would allow to effectively reach the goal of a level playing field and corresponds to the spirit of solidarity needed to translate words into political decisions. And third, the financing mechanism should be with very long-term maturity, at least 25 years, to spread the significant short-term costs through time. A front-loading of the Recovery Fund is urgently needed as a bridge to anticipate some of the resources to the second half of 2020, because the fund is supposed to be linked to the multi-annual financial framework. It will be of fundamental importance that both on the Recovery Fund and on the multi-annual financial framework, all member states are fully coherent with their political responsibility. Further delays on the fund and on the MFF would endanger the beginning of a full economic recovery. In this crucial phase for Europe, we are not facing a zero-sum negotiation. There will not be winners and losers. Either we will all win, or we will all lose. Europe cannot accept that the heaviest global pandemic results in an unprecedented disintegration process. Let's work all together to make Europe win. Thank you.
L'Europe ne se fera pas d'un coup.
You know that special feeling when you finally see the bigger picture? When you look at something from a different angle and suddenly it all makes sense? When people from different backgrounds and cultures work together? sharing insights, looking for answers, posing new questions about the world we live in. Remarkable things happen at intersections. And the European University Institute in Florence is where you experience it. Pursue your PhD in economics, history, law, or political and social sciences.
I decided to do my PhD at the EUI because it provides a unique structure of the PhD, where you can fully work on your own project.
Our professors are eager to help you contribute in your own way to a better understanding of our ever-changing world. Our campus is located among the beautiful hills overlooking Florence. We offer a well-structured and fully funded PhD program with close supervision, advanced courses, and training opportunities.
The UI makes a huge effort in bringing top professionals to come and give seminars to us. They also pay a lot of attention in making sure that they're matching with your supervisor.
You will have access to our first-class research library and the historical archives of the European Union.
To me, the role of archive is fundamental. As an early modern historian, but at UI you find one of the most important archives in Europe.
You'll get plenty of opportunity to interact with visiting experts and leaders.
I would say that the student life at the UI is very lively. I mean, there are many clubs for sports activities or acting or music.
Experience a truly international environment in the company of over 1,000 scholars from 75 countries. You will make connections for life.
Why would I recommend the EUI to new researchers? Well, I think it is because in this place you come here with your own research topic. You come here on your own proposal, and I think that's really unique. And I think if you use it right, then you can really make it an unforgettable time.
Apply now and become the best you can be.
We turn to network science for answers. Our study suggests that we can open the economy as long as we protect workers who for their jobs must travel far. Network science tells us that a small fraction of long-distance connections is responsible for the rapid spread of a virus. This is illustrated in the top two charts. Block these long-range connections and the virus will suddenly spread much more slowly. This is illustrated in the bottom two charts. Also, new flare-ups of the virus will remain local longer, allowing geographically confined interventions at the city or neighborhood level. This is illustrated in the bottom left chart, where the virus gradually and slowly grows outward from an initial outbreak. By contrast, in the top right chart, the virus is quickly everywhere. So what should a government do if it has limited medical resources, limited ability and willingness to impose on individual freedoms? We believe that it may wish to focus those limited resources heavily on long-range commuting, transport and delivery sectors. To open up the local economy, give people local breathing room, but prevent the transmission of the virus over long distances. Fortunately, because most face-to-face contact is naturally very close to home, the burden on the economy and society may remain limited.